Here at Psychology Ninjas, we're tackling an optional unit today with criminological psychology. Today we're looking at psychological treatments, and this breaks down into several different possible treatments that you might do. In a broad umbrella term, we might talk about cognitive behavioural therapy, and in actual fact, anger management is a specific type of CBT. Alternatively, you could talk about social skills training or assertiveness training, but the purpose of this video is going to focus on CBT and specifically anger management. So we still want to think about this, and this is a therapy, and therefore very similarly to a theory, we're going to explain the key terms associated with that particular therapy. When we're thinking about anger management as a form of CBT, it's really important that we're focusing here on changing how an offender thinks, their cognitions, and not only by doing that can you change behaviour. We must reshape their thinking processes so that rational responses or non-violent responses are the automatic rather than what they have already been doing. Here we'd also talk about Ireland's research in relation to this. You could also use Ireland's research as part of your evaluation instead. But my feeling is that this leaves you potentially a little bit light in terms of your explanation. We then move through and talk about the 3 different stages of anger management. Talking about cognitive preparation and what this entails, skill acquisition, and you want some specific behavioural techniques that you are going to teach that offender. The more detail you can give here, the better, especially if that's a discussed question. And then we'd be talking about application and practice. It's key here that we talk about behavioural activation events or homework, and that we would give them opportunities to practice those skills outside of those therapy sessions. You want to be clear here when you're talking about CBT about how this works for offenders, because this will reappear in clinical psychology. So how do we evaluate? Well, this is a therapy, and therefore we're using desert as our way of evaluating. Be careful here with your spelling so that you don't add an extra S and make this about a dessert, delicious after dinner treat, and therefore get yourself confused about what the other S means. So when we're breaking this down and using desert, we always want to make sure that we're giving 2 sides of the argument to develop logical chains of reasoning. Where we're talking about something being directive, that means that it's controlled by the therapist or the person in power. They are using their expert knowledge in order to control the behaviour of someone else, albeit for their own benefit. This is an important example that we could use in issues and debates later on. How does this look in terms of our exam questions? Well, here we've got a 16 marker. Evaluate 1 psychological treatment for offenders. Be really clear here that where the exam board is talking about psychological explanations or treatments, they mean non-biological, not just anything that you have studied in psychology. Here we'd want to use an integrated approach where we're explaining and then evaluating in order to maximise our marks. So we talk here about CBT and what that involves in terms of changing cognitions and then behaviour. And then we'd move through and talk about our directiveness. That actually CBT is less directive, and that's a strength. That the offender has control over what cognitive preparation they do, what they disclose to the therapist, but also how they apply and engage in practice. On the flip side of this, it's the therapist that does exert some directiveness, that they decide which cognitions to focus on and which behaviour strategies in order to teach the offender. You could also say here that the therapist decides which behavioural activation events and which flashpoints are then practiced, which does mean that there is a level of expert power and social control held by the therapist at the expense that might exploit that offender. We then move in and talk about Ireland, and we're going to support the level of effectiveness of CBT, of anger management, by using Holbrook's research. This means that we're focusing specifically on findings because we're using this for evaluation. Our counter-argument here comes from Howell et al. They focused on the fact that the beneficial effects of anger management don't last more than 6 months, and therefore this investment that we're putting in may not be worth it. It may also be that this is because the offender doesn't practice when they're no longer in contact with the therapist. Overall, we could talk about that this has external reliability, that we do have consistent findings to say that anger management is improving violence and reducing anger and violent behaviour. We're going to move on through to cognitive preparation as the first stage of anger management. We're focusing here on redefining events as less threatening. And then we can talk about our S in DESERT, which is side effects. That actually there have been some side effects where we've taught people anger management and they've actually convinced the parole board to release them. And this was Hansen. And after being released from prison, even having anger management, he still went on to reoffend. And therefore, it is having a negative effect for society. Equally, there might be some negative side effects for the therapist, that as part of application and practice you're deliberately provoking potentially quite violent offenders. As our mini conclusion here and judgment, we're then talking about this having a socially sensitive consequence and being something that might not be in the public interest. We'd move on through to then talk about skill acquisition. Here in terms of our evaluation, we're talking about expense. The expensive part for CBT is having a highly qualified, trained professional, and given that we're dealing with offenders, this is going to be even more important. On the flip side of that, it is time limited, about 16 sessions of CBT, and therefore, compared to some other psychological therapies, it's going to be a lot cheaper. We have difficulties in terms of application here, and that the expense or the level expense that we're willing to put out for CBT is going to have a repercussion, and it might not be politically savvy to spend a lot of money on offenders. We now talk about the final stage, which is application and practice. We've moved this around a little bit in case you start to run out of time in the exam. Here we're then evaluating in terms of reasons. This is more holistic and in sub-stages does look at the reasons behind offending in terms of the thought process. However, it does not acknowledge other factors why offending might be beneficial in terms of psychological formulation, and it doesn't acknowledge socioeconomic factors for offending behaviour, and therefore is going to still be reductionist overall. Finally, we then talk about cognitive preparation in terms of flashpoint events, and this is going to lead us into types of people, that actually only certain types of people are going to benefit from anger management and CBT. Although we're saying here that there is predictive validity, that actually this does have a long-lasting effect for some people, it's more important here that actually those people who are ready to change and are willing to change is going to be the most influential factor on whether CBT is effective. Therefore, older participants, and in this case older offenders who are more ingrained in their behaviour, it may be less beneficial for these individuals. Let's have a look at some exam questions now. Here we've got a 2-mark, explain a strength. However, this is with a STEM, and therefore we'd need to make sure that that strength was linked into Milton's scenario. So we need here to be talking specifically about offenders and a prison stay. The focus for this question is a psychological treatment, and therefore must be something non-biological in order to gain credit. Here we've got another exam question, 16 marks this time. We've got evaluate the extent. And therefore, we're really thinking about this as a to what extent question rather than a balanced evaluate question. We want to be having a judgment here on how effective psychological treatments will be for Vasu. It's important here, given the breakdown of marks, that we ensure that we're applying what we would talk about for our psychological treatment to this particular case study. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.